business?
So we actually have an action item.
Associated with that. I would move approval of waiving liquidated damages for breach of individual teacher contract as presented during the closed session.
Second. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Ayes have it, motion is carried. Any nays?
Yeah.
Motion is carried. All right, moving on. Order of business, public appearances. We have 2 today. First is Julie Anderson. Would you like to come up to speak?
I just wanted to provide some community input with respect to the elementary school reconfiguration. As a mom of a kindergartner that just started a week and a half ago, the email was a little concerning to receive, more so again with just having a kindergartner starting and just the appearance of the speed and the lack of transparency that the consideration of the plan has been undergone. And so that lack of transparency was concerning. And the reason for it is because it's not clear what type of considerations that are being included as part of this decision, which really has the potential to disrupt neighborhoods and the community. That being said, I'm not either for or against the plan. It's just the concern of making sure that the decision isn't being made in a vacuum without some of the additional factors that really do go hand in hand with reconfiguring schools and dividing a community into neighborhood schools. So for example, Cottage Grove, anyone that lives in Cottage Grove knows Cottage Grove is rapidly expanding. And so the concern that I have is with drawing attendance boundary lines, how do you do it in a manner where you're not constantly having to go back every year and redraw new boundary lines? And so causing additional disruption to families and unnecessary transitions. And with that, forging a relationship with both the town of Cottage Grove and the village of Cottage Grove, with determining where is development and expansion to avoid overtaxing one school over the other. And so again, perhaps these are all being considered, but without the lack of transparency, it's concerning to see how the decision making is potentially being made and what data and information is being considered as part of this decision making. Really, as a parent, my concern is I just want the decision to be thoughtful and strategic, and without that transparency, that's difficult and more concerning on my part. So that was pretty much my input.
Thank you. Susan?
So I get to ask a question.
Yes, absolutely.
Because of the information you provided. One, tell us your background in the community.
So I actually grew up in Monona. I went to Maywood, Winnequa, Monona Grove, left the area and moved back to the area and decided to locate in Cottage Grove because of the history with the district. So I'm very familiar with the district. I'm familiar with how schools have been reconfigured intimately. That being said, my concern is also the district does have experience reconfiguring schools. Nichols and Maywood is a great example of that. However, dividing a community into neighborhood schools and taking into account all of the other potential socioeconomic impacts that come into play, that I think is probably that's outside the history of the district. That being said, are there resources that can be leveraged to take all of that into consideration? Absolutely, but again, without that transparency, that's difficult to ascertain whether that is indeed being part of that thoughtful decision making. I'm an attorney by trade, so of course these are the types of questions where I go to, and just again, as a working parent, my concern is that disruption, and then and also just disrupting the cohesiveness of still, even although rapidly expanding, still a smaller community, and so that impact on the student experience is also concerning. Wraparound care, another concern with drawing attendance lines. And if a wraparound daycare program is outside the attendance area for the new drawn lines, is that going to be an issue? Are there going to be additional busing services, et cetera? All of these things that I think, again, I'm not for or against it. I just want to ensure that that sort of community input is being considered as part of this decision making, because again, although the reconfiguring decision is within, the sole authority of the district, I'm concerned that that decision is being made in a vacuum. Again, maybe it's not, but without that transparency, it's difficult to know.
And then do you have a recommendation to the board for a process? If in fact, educationally, this is a recommendation from a committee,
Sure.
do you have a recommendation to the board for a process for moving forward?
My recommendation would be slow down and start thinking about, as part of that decision, do you have all of the stakeholders, so you've now had an educational recommendation. I would recommend then doing another phase where you're getting additional stakeholders and getting additional feedback. Because again, I think that city planning aspect is really important, especially for the next few years in Cottage Grove. It's going to continue to rapidly grow. I mean, there was one new area just in the last 12 months, 12 houses just went up. Those likely are having little kids. Depending on where those lines are drawn, to avoid having to continuously redraw them, I really think you need to start forging that relationship and getting that aspect in plan, because it's key. I mean, I just don't see how else you're able to thoughtfully implement and make decisions without that sort of partnership and that feedback from the town and the village at that aspect. So I would say, like, you would need a second phase to, start taking into account some of those additional factors, because otherwise I'm concerned the decision's being made in a vacuum. Any other questions?
No other questions? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, next is Amber Steele.
So that's me, and I actually don't have a whole lot more to add after that.
Thank you, Amber. All right, moving to the,
Is that because you changed your mind, or
No.
because you were just
She
going
was so amazing, just essentially
Go up and say ditto, and then,
Yeah.
yeah, it's perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, I appreciate it.
all right, and then I have a motion for the consent agenda.
I move the consent agenda as presented.
Second.
All right, all
Hang
those,
on.
yes,
I have a question.
yes.
Staff contract amendments, I didn't see anything.
Yeah, so that's a standing item on the agenda, and there were none. for this
Okay,
agenda.
so there isn't.
Correct.
All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Motion is carried. Oh, yes.
Just 2 minutes. I just want to thank Tish for her work. Yes. She did major work on the minutes, which are included in the consent agenda, and I just wanted to thank her for, it wasn't easy.
Thank you. All right, moving on to recognitions.
Okay, so the first recognition actually is something you just approved in the consent agenda, a very sizable donation to the district. So a big thank you to the Jesse Vetter Corporate Foundation, who raised $15,000 at the annual Vetter Golf Classic, which was donated to the Monona Grove Athletics Program in August. The Vetter family are Monona Grove alumni, and we appreciate their continued support. September 1st was the first day of school, and we're thankful for our staff who helped make the transition back into school life as smooth as possible. We've had a successful first few days in our classrooms and look forward to what our students will learn and accomplish this year. And congratulations to the Monona Grove Cross Country team for their performance at the recent Monona Grove Invitational. The girls team secured first place with 3 top 10 finishers, while the boys team achieved 7th place. Great job to the varsity volleyball team that took home a win last week at Oregon. The girls' tennis team has also had a successful season so far. Last Thursday, the team brought home 3 singles wins, and we certainly wish all of our athletic teams the best of luck as they continue their season.
Great.
Thanks, Lorraine. In regards to back to school and sort of pre-back to school and the back to school nights, which were incredible. I was able to attend 2 because of my own kids, but talked with other folks that were able to attend the buildings that I was in, and the energy was fantastic. So thanks to the administrators and all the teachers and staff for putting on a really fantastic, welcoming start to the school year.
Thank you for sharing that. Yes.
Yes, and if I may add to that, as a student, I'm seeing a wondrous response to the influx of freshmen at the high school. Overall, I have to say that teachers, as well as the current student body, have been very accommodating to the new members of our district, which, given the expansion of Monona Grove, I'm sure is likely a expanding theme in the high school as well as in our other schools. So I'd just like to note that while we are currently experiencing a lot of changes and a lot of growth, I could not be more satisfied and optimistic about the year ahead of us.
All right, thank you, Krishna. All right, no correspondence and announcements. Moving on to administrative reports. 2022-2023 seclusion and restraint report, Krista Foster.
Yeah, I'll just introduce it if I'm coming out. And as you know, this is an annual report required by state statute. And just in addition to board docs today, there's a request for some historical data. And so if you click on that link, if you want to see back another 4 years as well to compare, you have that information. But Krista provided a report, so she's glad to take any questions.
Yes. Yeah, mainly take questions. As Dan said, this is a required report for folks who are new. We present this annually and talk just a little bit about our efforts around proactive and preventative behavior, or behavior response, and obviously just that reminder that physical restraint and seclusion are always a last resort in any situation where there is a clear, present, imminent danger to self or others. I won't read through the entire report, but you can see it's relatively consistent with previous years, last year, and then we had those COVID years in there, so you will see that there are some differences in the data for the years that we were not fully present in school for the entire year. I'll pause and let you take a, yep. Go ahead.
What concerns you about these numbers?
What concerns me? Well, I think a couple of years ago, as someone said, I think our goal would be 0. We're not at 0, obviously. We have students with needs in our buildings, and we're serving a wide range of learners. I think the fact that we haven't seen a dramatic increase, and we're actually lower than we were pre-COVID, is something that, we're happy about. I think what the story doesn't tell when we present the data in this way is the actual, responses to individual students, right? So what has been the impact of the plans put in place as a result of any of the incidences of seclusion or restraint? And I think that's the work that's done in the building every day. And so as far as that piece of it, I'm not sure there's a lot of concern with some of the data and the overall numbers of incidences. And in some cases, I think there's dramatic decreases in the number of incidents as were reported in previous years. It's relative to the size of our buildings and the student populations. And I think we've talked about this in previous years too. The fact that it is skewed toward elementary is very typical as students are learning and the staff are getting to know students and putting effective plans into place.
I know the numbers are small and statistics is an issue here, but I do notice one thing, which is that what's strongly driving this is students with disabilities.
Of course.
But that it seems more so than in the past when I compare the numbers.
Yeah, sometimes it takes a while for a student to be determined to be a student with a disability, so it's entirely possible that within this set of numbers there are students who may have appeared in previous years' data as a student not with a disability and maybe have been identified since then. You can say that with a fair amount of confidence, and then also just, right, I think just being proactive, and a few students can make a big difference, and a few difficult situations can make a big difference in these numbers.
Eric?
Go ahead, Eric.
I know COVID makes numbers hard, it's using quite a bit, and actually it's not more than the past, it's less pre-COVID, it was 60-some, I think, by the
Correct,
district.
yeah.
So it's actually less.
It's identical to last year, and the
But
pre-COVID
my
years.
question is, any time, and as a, career special educator, I'm always concerned when I see numbers that, are high with that population of students. And I understand, as someone who works in the field, that this is something that is unfortunately part of the job and necessary, even though we would all like to see 0.
Right.
But, What I would like to ask you is about the staffing. I'm wondering if the schools, like, for instance, it changes every year, but for right now, Winnequa has high numbers. For a school like Winnequa with these high numbers, in your opinion, is that school staffed enough? And if there was more staff, would those numbers potentially be lower?
I think the behavior that's a difficult question to answer, right?
Sure.
I don't think that the behavior that prompts a seclusion restraint or at what point that's sort of triggered would change regardless of staffing, so I just want to be really clear about that. If you're asking, are we adequately staffed? Has there been a growing need? Yes. Have been paying really close attention to our staffing levels and what allows us to continue to be proactive? Yes. I don't know that necessarily, because it is a bit of a moving target. In other years, we've talked about other schools with higher numbers and a small number of students who took a while to settle in.
Yeah.
And I'll just note that I think we continue to see those trends of our younger learners coming in from not yet being in school. What takes the most time is kind of figuring out those individuals new to us, or in most cases, new to school.
Sure.
Like if you were to break this down by grade level, we'd see those kindergarten, 4K, first grade numbers would definitely be reflected and then as we get to know students and wrap teams around them and have time to put a plan in place and be thoughtful about it. It's that relationship, I think, between the staff and the students more so than just sheer numbers of staff.
Then if I can follow that up, with what you said, with the staffing and the relationship, is the environment and the space, using the least restrictive environment, is other options for different programs with different spaces or in different areas, is that something that could be beneficial to decrease this number? As in, for example, having students have a different option than going to, let's say, first grade, where we know there's, I'm just using this as an example, there's been 6 incidences in this first grade class. Has it been thought about, like, well, maybe this first grade class isn't the right environment or the least restrictive environment for this student, and do we have options outside of that?
I think the options when you're talking about the handful of students that are reflected in these data are in the individual plan, right?
Okay.
So like, do we have some students who have those breaks planned and built into their day? Absolutely, as part of that plan. Are there ways to look at the dynamics of a classroom that might be impacting the number of incidences? But I think it really gets down to that individual functional behavior assessment and behavior plan that drives that, and then we meet the needs of that individual student. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I have a quick question, and then Philip, and then Elizabeth. Just demographic information I didn't see. I would be interested in knowing, like, students of color, how they are impacted by this. Do we have data on that at all?
We do have the data. I didn't prepare it for tonight, but we do keep track of that when we're recording the data internally.
Okay.
Of kind of what that looks like and look for patterns. It is so individual student specific.
Okay. Do you kind of have a rough number in your head if, like, it's a higher?
It's not different than I think our overall special education population representation. So it's not one area where we've identified a large disproportionality with race, ethnicity, for sure. Obviously with disability, yes, our students with disabilities are highly represented or overrepresented in this group, but I think we've talked a little bit about why that tends to be the case. I would say those are the two areas we've looked at. We look at consistently our disability status and race, ethnicity.
Okay, thank you. Philip?
I'm curious about seclusion versus restraint. And just reading the definitions in the policy, I guess kind of 2 questions. One, is my assumption accurate that seclusion versus restraint, like restraint is beyond seclusion in terms of potentially how you might perceive the severity of that? And if that's true, within, say, the 24 at Winnequa or the 6 at Taylor Prairie, do you have a sense for is half of those seclusion and half of those were restraint, or I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I'll talk in kind of in a general terms.
Yeah.
That is a really good question, and I think it is purposeful the way they have us prepare this report kind of statutorily is because, especially with the most recent revamp of the guidance too, it really, I think, highlights the fact that seclusion is not necessarily I mean, in the scheme of things, certainly, like anytime you have to put your hands on a student, that's a higher level of risk. But the goal is to treat them sort of as equally problematic. So, and even in our training, our nonviolent crisis intervention training, and we go over this with staff, it's really the same standard for both. Sometimes it's easier to seclude a student or prevent them from leaving, but they're really treated under that same standard. So I do think, just to kind of give that context, I think it's really purposeful that from an impact standpoint, they treat both incidences sort of equally, or of equal importance or significance.
Sure.
When we track them, a lot of times it might be a both, like there was a brief physical intervention and a longer period of seclusion. Overall, the restraint is less frequent than seclusion.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, Krista.
Hi.
How are you?
Great.
It's our favorite time of year.
know.
So a couple of things, couple of observations is, one, I'm really happy to see a lot of these numbers, like 0 across MG21, GDS, and Monona Grove, which at the high school like vacillates between 1 and 0 historically. But when I look at the data, like Glacial Drumlin's never been at 0, for example, right? So that's a good thing. I know this time last year we talked about Taylor Prairie and my concerns around the littles, and like that number is way down too, which is fantastic and great. Cottage Grove seems stable, which seems to me then to imply, at least looking at the raw numbers, that it's not necessarily the students, right? Like you had a big number last year at Taylor Prairie, and then you would expect then if those students were persistent in their behavioral difficulties that you would see that big bump at CGS, and you didn't, right? So that to me speaks to systems, right? Systems are working, students are getting supports they need, certainly maturity has something to do with that. So that's great. I just want to pause and acknowledge that during the seclusion and restraint meeting, I said something positive about seclusion and restraint in our numbers. So kudos to you and your team for that work. Question about Winnequa, right, which is now sort of in the river. I mean, that's a pretty significant jump from last year.
From 1 year to 1 year.
Yes, yeah. Just the 1 year jump, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that. And I'm curious to know because, right, I understand. We don't need to belabor like my thoughts and feelings around littles and the use of seclusion or restraint around littles, but given the success of Taylor Prairie from 1 year to the next, I guess a wondering that I have is, to what extent I know your student services group is close, but it's not just about student services, right? It's about systems and system setup and environmental, the way the environments are set up and the way the relationships are built and all of those pieces that make a difference in how dysregulation shows up. And so I'm just kind of curious about like, have you talked at all as a building teams about some lessons learned or differences in maybe how Taylor Prairie has approached things, right, versus Winnequa? If there are like system exchange kinds of pieces that you could apply, because I look at Taylor Prairie and I think that's a pretty big, like a good success story, and I would love to come back next year and see it all at 0, right? Still gonna hope for that. But have like that same success for Winnequa, where it's like, well, last year we had over 20, and this year we had 4. So that long-winded question, but that's kind of my one.
Yeah, and I think I know where you're going. So a couple of things in terms of, I would say, multiple elementary buildings, if not all of them. I just can't speak as specifically to all of them, but the teams did meet. I mean, that looking at the number of seclusion restraint, but this is like this end of it. I would say there's a lot of effort, and teams did work over the summer, and it's pretty consistent that they would do that. But like looking at the the calls to the classroom in general, right? So looking at behavior, down to like our number of incidents and things like that. But in an elementary school, there's a lot happening that's not necessarily going to end up being a seclusion restraint or even a major referral that we're not going to document in Infinite Campus. So I would say yes, the teams have spent a lot of time looking at their behavior response, their systems, the proactive pieces that they're layering in there. And they're all doing, I would say that there are some differences between the approach to that. Like we're not talking about Brandon, but like one building, right? So building in that prompt language from Ross Green into the behavior process, and like how are we getting out in front of? That's one example. And that just happens to be the one I saw this week, so I'm mentioning it. But so do the buildings talk? Yes. Do they compare strategies, and again, the Ross Green training is one like shared element that the teams have had. Nonviolent crisis intervention training is the shared element. I guess when it comes down to this report and this information, I would also say it's much more about looking at that individual group of students who are reflected in this information and kind of what that trajectory looked like for a building. It's a little tricky, right? Because kind of just keeping in mind the integrity of the students and the folks involved, and a particular student having a difficult time can really impact these numbers in a short way. And I will say there's some other things you could look for in your data when we're looking at it and look like it's like, what did September and October look like, and then what was the like when we got to know students and figured some things out and put some plans in place, kind of those comparisons of beginning of year to year on data. And there's just a lot that can't be captured in a quick summary, which I know these are great questions. So what you're really getting at is, do we pay close attention anytime there's an incident? Absolutely. If there's repeat incidents, absolutely. You know, how quickly the teams are responding with team consultations, behavior plans, IEP revisions if appropriate, or going down that path even already. So I guess I just hesitate to say too much that it's like, oh, we figured something out here versus like, oh, we had some kids struggled with some things here and we figured it out versus this. I don't know that
I appreciate
tells
that.
The story. If this data tells a different story.
I appreciate that. I think that's always the problem when you have to like put in a report in aggregate, right? It's like sort of like, here's the thing, and maybe all these occurred in the first week of school. I have no idea.
Correct.
And it would be interesting to see for when we think about preparing this report next year or sort of whenever. I don't know, Dan, what the plan is around like the building principals and administrative kind of discussion, right, that we've had at board meetings kind of throughout the year in the past, but to think about the overarching trends of like beginning of the year versus end of the year, just from that perspective, because I think for us as a board, it's hard to be like, that's 24 highly impactful instances over 8 students, right? That's like, it's a lot for a little kid. And so what does it really look, what is the real story there kind of behind those numbers? I think could be kind of a really important thing for us to know and understand, just as trends. And then my follow-up question to you, and this is the last one I have, is how is debriefing going?
Yeah, I think that's something the teams really have spent quite a bit of time working on debriefing. She updated like a forum to use for debriefing, so whatever helps the teams get to that point or that process of like, okay, what happened? What did we see? What did you see? I would say it's a strength. Like our team responses are definitely a strength. So you've got that, third person usually, or third or fourth, like just who's really just taking the notes and the whole version that I get back, right? Like it's a clear, very clear outline of the incident and what happened. So there's a lot of good information is gathered and reflection about what to happen next time. And, I think I say it every year, but I mean, it's certainly something that, everyone takes seriously and is really diligent about their documentation, communication with families. This is never a surprise. And the goal is, right, if it happens once, we don't want it to happen again. And if there's a bigger issue going on, it's that wraparound to get things in place as quickly as possible.
Great.
Rochelle, I do see your hand. I have one other question. So I know for the older students, we do restorative justice. Do we do that with the youngers as well? Okay. Yes. And these students that...
In pockets all around, right? So yeah, I can't necessarily speak to like, what does that look like for all of these students? They wouldn't be like exempt from that, right? Like, so I think it looks a little different in every space, but that is definitely, the response to the behavior is a different story to tell, right? So lots of opportunity there for repair and restoration and thoughtful about how to handle it. That's what isn't in this picture, right? It's like, what have we done? What has happened?
That's great. Thank you. Rochelle and then Susan, maybe?
I think you kind of answered the questions. I was just thinking of some of these incidents, there may be a total of, 8 students involved, but there may be 1 or 2 of them that are really struggling.
Correct.
And until you find that balance of what works for them, this, like you're saying, next year, once you get through this year, it may be very different.
Yes. We would definitely not expect to carry over the same 8 students with the same number, like, to the next year, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Taylor Prairie
Right,
CGS
that's a good
example
vision,
is
that's a good way
great.
to see it, because,
Exactly.
right, yeah.
Susan?
So Krista, this is really helpful, and I appreciate that. In some of the previous years, we got last year's with this year's. So could, maybe even put it up so that we could see those numbers?
Sure. Dan did link in the
It's
past
linked in board
4
docs.
years, just recently, like just today, I believe. So there are
Okay, so that
the
link
previous
is,
years are
is
in
in-
here.
It's in board
Yeah.
docs, I'll show you.
it's in board docs,
Yeah,
okay.
yes.
And
Yes,
when
board
did
docs.
that come up? Was that in the
It's
report?
recent, yeah.
It's recent, I put in a request for it earlier today.
Okay,
Right there
well,
where it says
just so
here's the
you
link.
know, it's kind of like the annual meeting, when you post it at 3:00, some of us are working, So, what
In
helps,
Krista's defense, she was also working when I put in the request, so.
but I appreciate that, and I appreciate that you
Yeah.
told
No,
me
that was a
that
good
it was
reminder. It's
there,
helpful context
because
to have.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at the
Yeah.
link.
Yeah.
But I think all you have to do is print last year's report or post that with it, and then minimally we can see that. And then if Elizabeth, with her background, wants to see 5 years, then we can see those pieces. Because we know the statute requires that we get it every year, so we know it's gonna be there.
Yeah.
And you can see the improvement that you've done. I just think that's such a valuable piece. Thank you, and I will go back and follow the link. Thank you, thank you.
It did come in.
Okay.
Yes, I did. Firstly, thank you so much, especially as a student. I really appreciate the opportunity to learn about circumstances like this. So my questions therefore to you would be, how may we best raise awareness for the student body, not only towards seclusion restraints, but also to the daily communal experiences of such individuals to foster stability and security within our districts? And following from that, what systems are in place to ensure that affected persons can speak up and collaborate with staff in order to support preventative measures and adjustments?
I think what you're asking about or wondering about, I think of more of those universal, like how do we set up our environments and our spaces to be welcoming, to be proactive, to be preventative in having plans in place for students who might need a bit of more wraparound support, right? Is that kind of getting at what you're asking for?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that is the work that occurs across the board too. So when we think about those universal expectations for students, opportunities for student voice, student participation in the restorative justice process, like from the initial onset of like how are we building community in our schools and having, whether it's advisory, morning meeting, community time, to helping students, even if they are struggling with a behavior, to have a voice in their school, their community, with their, have safe and trusted adults that they can go to help problem solve when things aren't working well for them. I think that's the effort that we're putting in on the front end that is for everyone and also definitely impacts our students who are most, who might have more challenges with feeling safe and connected at school.
Yeah, for sure. Just one reason I was especially curious is because I remember when I was in secondary and I just moved to the district, I remember a lot of times getting fix-it plans. And so, kind of thinking from then how I definitely needed to figure out how I fit into the community and then go to now to the point where obviously I have a lot of appreciation for the work that staff and students do to ensure such a helpful community. I want to make sure that we're staying on top of that to ensure that such students, yes, face the consequences and learn to be responsible, but also have the environment to get the support they need.
And be welcomed back into the classroom environment, the school environment, yeah.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Any other questions? Krista? Okay, thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, next is the superintendent report. Dan?
Okay, I've got 2 items this evening. The first one is to put on your radar that the 5-year charter with MG21 expires at the end of this school year. And so that a new charter will be brought forth to this board for approval, most likely in about April in the spring, but we're starting to work on it now. And so, and you will get updates along the way. You won't just get it at the last minute to approve. And just wanted to put on your radar one fairly significant change that you can expect is in the leadership structure. As you may recall, when the last charter was written 5 years ago. We had just high school only for about 40-some students, and it's a teacher-led school. Then we have an administrative liaison that provides support. Since that time, we've added a middle campus with grades 6 through 8, and we've expanded to over 80 students. And so things have changed a little bit as far as what their needs are. And so that's what I've shared with you as a draft proposal that the staff at MG21 has put together with the work of a consultant. And the governance board is in the process of having conversations about that. And so the way the process will work is I will work with the governance board on that charter, keep you informed along the way. And if we're all in agreement, it's easy, we bring it forth and the governance board approves the charter, this board approves. If we have some challenges in working that out, then we get the groups together and we work through those differences. But I will tell you for the record, I do support a change in the leadership structure. I think it's necessary based upon the growth that they've had, and it's just a matter of kind of working out the details and what that might look like.
Eric?
Dan, with the new recommendation on the leadership change, would this essentially have a principal there now?
Essentially, yeah. I think they're not using the term principal, but an administrator on their staff.
An administrator with a license.
Correct.
Which is not how it's set up right
Correct.
now.
Yes.
And it does, do you know if the staff, the teachers at MG21, would they be supportive of that since they're teacher-led right now?
Yeah, this came 100% from the staff.
Okay, because they're seeing that would be helpful for them to have that position.
Yes.
To alleviate probably some of the things that they are dealing with, like on a daily basis. Then there's not an administrator there,
Yeah.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
I mean, currently the arrangement is we have part-time
Correct.
administrative, and do you know what percentage of time that is?
Well, for the record, we listed on our DPI report of about a 20% position. I would say that there's times it's evolved into more of a 50% support, and yeah.
All right, no other questions? Susan?
And Dan, I know, some people might not be aware that we've had a variety. Do you assign kind of a principal or administrative person to that building every year? Isn't that how it goes?
Yeah, it has changed over time. Traditionally, or when the school started, one of the high school APs had that role. And then with the middle campus coming on board, that made it a little bit trickier, and so we actually had a couple, dual role. And then the last few years, we've had someone from our district level position to be that person. So it's currently Shelby Steele who fills that position.
Yes, and I think one of the challenges that we were able to get feedback about as a board previously was, if you had an assistant principal up at the high school and there were things they needed to work on at MG21, they really had a full-time job at the high school. And it was difficult to do that. And so I think trying to look at other options for that support, including what's appearing to be a need for a specific person, a specific hire for that, based on the history of that and how that worked, I can understand why they would be coming forward with that request.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate your comments, and I just want to clarify as well. Historically, the people who have been in that position have done an outstanding job, and it's really worked well. It's just becoming more of a capacity issue. Right?
Yes, I think so too. I know we've heard such positive things about Shelby and those relationships. But I think it's really hard to take somebody that is a full-time principal of over 500, 1,000 kids and say, or the assistant principal who has more than a full-time job, well, you also have this charter school with these goals and these objectives and things that we're doing differently from this.
Yeah.
It's a whole new learning environment for that administrator. So I appreciate that you've been looking at other ways to fulfill that need.
All right.
Just really quick.
Yes.
I just wanted to say, did the governance board put this draft recommendation document together?
They did not.
Who?
This came from the teachers,
Okay.
the teacher work group.
It looks, I really appreciate the structure of the document. The
Mhm.
background's really well laid out. I feel like it's very clear. The progression of how they did it is really clear. I liked that they linked not just the job descriptions, but also the division of responsibilities for like all of the staff that are there. So I just wanted to say that to the folks who created this document. It was
Yeah.
really helpful. It was
Yeah.
really helpful.
Yeah, and to be clear, I should, if it is a work group, primarily of teachers, I do believe there was governance board representation.
Sure, yeah.
But it is primarily the teacher group.
It's just like really, it's a really nice proposal.
Mhm.
All right, no other questions?
Just one more comment. Again, we've had such success there, and I urge each and every board member, I know several already do this, to minimally go to the graduation, because it tells a story that you may not know. That's definitely worth hearing.
Just get there early. It fills up.
There's a little tough.
All right, Dan, you want to move to the 2023-24 enrollment update?
Yeah, so there's a document with enrollment. The official third Friday count will be this upcoming Friday, and so the numbers, always change slightly. But just to give you an idea where we're at and compared to where we were a year ago. So the first page of this document shows our enrollment by grade level as of September 5th. And you'll see from a year ago, up about 150 students. And again, that's not unexpected. That's actually pretty much right on with the projections that we used, in the spring. The second page actually shows the breakdown of those students by resident versus open enrollment. And so if you look at the far right column, you see the net change, and that's, what we've talked about, the big change in residents. So 123 new resident students, open enrollment 27. And so we are actually scaling back the open enrollment. The reason that's still an increase, we have a lot of students who are residents. They move out of the district and then apply for open enrollment so they can continue. Well, they count as an open enrollment student. And we still have had seats, as you know, at some grade levels as well that we've had new students in. But this is the resident growth that we've been expecting, for the last few years. And so it's something we'll continue to monitor, again, looking ahead to next year, but it really has been a positive thing. We have space for it, we are expecting the growth, and it's nice to see it happen.
Elizabeth?
Just a quick question, Dan, about when do we tip the threshold for needing new FTE
Yeah.
with the class side guidelines? Because I know there's the goal and then there's the guidelines, and we're in some places where we're right at the goal, right, or a little bit above the goal, but obviously still within the range. And so I'm just curious, when would new FTE be triggered?
Yeah, so anytime we hit that goal, we're monitoring it really closely.
Okay.
And so there's not a magic number exactly when we get there, but for instance, one of the things we'll look at is, the policy is the goal for second grade is 20 per section, and then in third grade it goes to 22. So if we're at 20 point something, we know the next year we're going to be back within where we want to be.
Yep.
But if we're in that place that we're in kindergarten, we're 20 the next 3 years, then we might move to add that staff a little bit quicker.
Got it, that makes sense.
Yeah, so, but definitely, we never want to reach the maximum of that
Yeah.
guideline.
Yeah.
Once we get to even one over that classroom goal, we're looking at adding staff.
Great, thank you.
No other questions? Okay, thank you, Dan. Moving on to board reports, Monona Grove Education Foundation, Susan.
The Monona Grove Education Foundation met yesterday afternoon, and Dan was unable to be there, so there wasn't a superintendent report, but we've gotten ours tonight, so that's really nice. Effectively, there were two major discussions. A major part of the meeting was a discussion about participation by the Monona Grove Education Foundation in a homecoming event with the goal of increasing their presence in the community and student support for who they are and what they do. They had several ideas. They talked about some involvement with the actual parade, with the actual event, providing mini grants, providing some type of award for the most innovative they used to be floats. I don't know that they're still doing floats, but something like that. So they were looking, and they're still having those discussions. There also was a review of their current plan process for soliciting donations, their letters, their board participation. That's effectively what they talked about for almost 2 hours. Well, it was an hour and a half, but yeah.
All right, thank you, Susan. All right, next is the Teaching, Learning, and Equity Committee. Elizabeth?
Yeah, so Teaching, Learning, and Equity Committee have met twice since we last talked about it. We met on August 22nd to continue the discussion around evaluating grade level configuration in Cottage Grove for 4K2. Board members will recall that on June 14th we had a board meeting where we talked about kind of what those factors are that the administration should be considering when bringing a recommendation to the board. So we saw the administration's results of that study at the August 22 meeting, and then we're able to make a recommendation through committee to the board, which is on the agenda for later today. And then we just met this past Monday to revise that recommendation, specifically to elongate the timeline a little bit, to make sure that that phase 2 portion, should the board take action tonight to move to a 4K2 community-based model in Cottage Grove, to allow more time for community and family input, as well as additional facilities planning. So more to come later on the agenda for that.
Okay, thank you. Great, moving on to possible action items. So you'll be taking the lead again for that. So for first one is 4K through 2.
Wow.
Grade configuration for Cottage Grove.
Without further ado, we shall move to the action item. I actually let Dan kick us off here.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
So as Elizabeth stated, the Teaching and Equity Committee has met twice to review this. So what we have for you tonight, we were going to share the slides that were presented at the committee meeting. We've made a couple slight updates, since that time, just to update some of the things that have happened since then with regard to communication and some enrollment projections and so on. And at that time, we had a pretty detailed presentation where our whole team took part. And so in putting this together, Lisa Height, Krista Foster, Katie Burns-Kaiser, as well as our principals, Emily Foster and Jesse Starr is with us tonight. Really, as a team, we went through this. I'm going to go through the slides myself, but pause at each part so that you can ask any specific follow-up questions to our team who, really worked hard in developing that. But I want to assume what your questions you may or may not have. So we'll just, as I said, pause on each part, and then after we go through the slides, we certainly can engage in discussion. Okay, so to start with the timeline, again, this takes us back to 2018, is when the board made the decision for the current configuration following the facilities referendum. We've talked about that, in the past. And so looking ahead here, these last 2 years, is we began in the 21 school year, the fall of 21, and then this past year in February is when our committee started taking a look at reviewing the configuration. And then we've had several meetings along the way, and as stated, it takes us up to this week. Okay, so we talked about 3 key considerations that the board needs to consider in making this decision. As we talked about, that if the board does move forward with this, the phase 1 was all about these 3 pieces: the student experience, financial impact, and then communication and engagement. And then if the board does agree to move forward, the phase 2 would be all of the just logistical things that we've talked about, things like attendance boundaries, staffing, and all those sorts of things. So tonight we'd like to talk about those 3 considerations and what the the basis of our findings and recommendations are in each of those areas. Okay, so when it comes to the student experience, we broke it down into 3 areas. Okay, obviously teaching and learning first and foremost. We know the social emotional learning of our students is also very important and impacted by the transitions. And then lastly, students as peer support in the school community. So those are the 3 areas that our team focused on, as well as the committee, when we looked at how does the grade configuration impact the student experience. Okay, so the teaching and learning, a summary of those. I won't read through all the bullet points, but really we looked at about how the curriculum works, the co-planning, and so on, and that those all things would remain consistent, regardless of the configuration. and the social emotional learning, the relationships students adults, and the school environment. And then, of course, with the peer support piece as well. So I think this would be a good place to pause when we talk about the student experience, and we can focus on any one of those areas that you'd like to expand upon. And again, our team, would be glad to answer any questions that you have in any of those 3 areas.
I just want to add on a little bit additional to what you said around the student experience pieces. And Krista and Lisa did a really nice job when they were at TLE back in August, talking about although the curricular pieces will stay the same, the co-planning pieces, right, remain the same, but it's that ability to sort of like strengthen those relationships because you know kids longer, they're in the building for longer, and then the ability for that curriculum to sort of stretch and specialize and have more opportunities there when you have just a wider range of grade levels in the building. We're kind of 2, I think, factors that are a potential improvement on our current configuration. Where kids are in for sort of a shorter amount of time. By the time you've established yourself in the building, you know who folks are. You're transitioning again to a brand new building and sort of starting over. And so that was a big point of discussion in TLE that we talked about on the 22nd. And I don't know, I don't want to misspeak for you, Krista and Lisa, so if you have anything to add there, that'd be great.
Peter and then Susan.
I was just going to ask for examples how this peer support plays out in Winnequa.
I'm going to defer to our team.
Good thing you're here, Jesse.
And
Yeah, so I mean, Winnequa has that amazing opportunity with students from 4K through 5th grade to have those relationships happen in the hallways, in passing periods, but then intentionally planning through buddy room activities. Even this year, they're doing some, hoping to kick off some kindergarten through 5th grade groups that, have representations from each grade level. So those relationships and, even morning supervision, playground opportunities, we see those opportunities. We spend the start of the year, talking to those 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders about their role as a leader in the school building and the younger group of learners looking up to them. And it's fun seeing them progress from being those youngest group of learners coming into Winnequa, and then taking over some leadership in the building in their later years before they transition to middle school. So, it's happening throughout the day, both strategically with things that we're planning, but also those peer interactions up and down the hallways throughout the school.
Thank you.
Susan?
I think these are great points, and this is very helpful to see that they've done this. One of the major concerns I have, and I think you'll hear me express this throughout the presentation, and that is, right now as a board member, I'm thinking that for me to make a decision tonight, I need teacher input about their feelings. I know Dan has gone out to the buildings, the 2 buildings, and had discussions, but I think I need some kind of feel about the feeling coming back on that and how they feel about that. The research is very clear that educationally this is, as you see, foundational curriculum, specialists, but you're going to put some teachers in one school and some teachers in another school, and these are teachers that may have built very strong relationships with each other and learning and processes that will be changed. I just really feel that it's very important to me as a board member to get clear input from the staff that will be affected by this. We actually studied this. We have studied this repeatedly. And in 2018, we had strong board support for this. But we had difficulty moving through the teacher concerns and the community concerns. And for me to make a final decision, I'd like to know we've addressed all those. And I've expressed that to Elizabeth, and she said, we're going to work on that after we get.
Well, there's actually 2 parts to that, right? So there's the teacher part and the community part. And so when we met in June, what we talked about was ensuring that the community stays informed, right, through our meetings and through correspondences from the district, and then doing more parent engagement and parent involvement on the actual planning side of it. And I think you heard that today, through our public comments, right? Like, where are the boundaries going to be? What's the transportation and busing going to look like? Will they be wrapped? Like, all of those things are like logistical, operational, and important to know. And that to me is like, especially like as a parent, like that's where that level of input I think is really essential. I think in terms of the teacher piece of it, and I'll let Dan, and I know that Emily and Jesse are here as well. So the administrators have been coming to TLE sort of representing this position, representing their staff. But part of the impetus for us meeting on Monday to elongate the timeline is to be sensitive to the ability to sort of get staff ready and prepared for kind of whatever that transition is going to be, as well as the community. And so that was part of the impetus of, right, because you'll remember the original action item was around next year, and instead what we're going to be recommending is potentially for the following year, so that we've got that time. So I hear you, Susan, and I agree with you, and so I think like I want to separate those two things so that we can really stay focused on kind of like the educational decision as it relates to like what's best for kids, and then the support around the actual logistical planning, which, like I said, to me as a parent, like that's what I want to know. Like, where are my kids going to go to school? How's the busing going to happen? Like, what is this going to look like?
Right.
Are my kids going to go here, and then my neighbor's going to go somewhere else? Like, those are the things to me, from my perspective, that feel like really necessary for deep family input and communication on.
I'm still, part of the thing for me in that decision is to be able to hear things. So the committee basically has no teachers on that committee and no community members on that committee now. In the past we have. So basically the input that we're getting right now is administrative through Dan, and then any other outreaching he does. I still, and I don't know this factually.
Well, that's not true, Susan. We do have, as it relates to this item, we've had all the elementary school principals represented on our TLE calls.
I'm talking about teachers.
Right. Well, what I'm saying is, you said you're only hearing it administratively for Dan, and I'm saying that's not true. We've had teacher we've had administrative representation, and like in TLE in general, we've got all kinds of folks coming in and out based on the agenda.
We're saying the same thing. We just are using administration differently. Dan is one administrator, and the principals are the other administrators, and the assistant principals, and all those others in those Krista and that group. It's still really important. Not that it's going to change the decision and my support, but I want to know that what the concerns might be from the staffing, so that I can be assured those are going to be addressed before I show approval, rather than approving it and saying, okay,
yeah, that's fair.
Moving into a process. I'd like to have that information. If we vote on it, then everything after that is just it's a process of working toward implementation compatibly. I'd like to be able to make sure that all the concerns have at least been identified and brought to you and your committee, which has done a really nice job of working on this.
So I'll punt to Dan and let him talk about
See, I'm just talking about holding the final decision till October. That's it, so that we have a month to put that piece in.
So Dan's been in conversation with building level staff, so I'll let Dan speak for himself on that piece.
It's coming up in a later slide, so I'll speak to it then.
Okay, great.
So again, right now, we're looking at
I'm sorry. Krishna had a question.
Yes, thank you so much. What I wanted to bring up is from a student perspective. Now, the benefits to having all this going on at such a young age is that we have time for the effects of these policies to compound in a student body. And with that, I wanted to orient perspective towards how we can impact topics and conversations around health and security of our schools with these communities and with these relations. And what I'm specifically focused on is, whereas a lot of concerns, especially regarding mental or physical health, might not become a large concern until they become a much more mature audience, particularly middle school as well as high school. we have a tremendous opportunity at this time to foster a community where there is openness to bring up those discussions, to having those conversations, and providing a support, or at least providing the opportunity for students to develop a support network for themselves. And so, in that regard, I'm curious to see how, with this policy, we can incentivize environments and communities where students not only have the ability to diversify their context and be able to see, especially from such an early age, different ways of life, different perspectives, different values, but also so that way we can allow for students to be able to grapple with and understand how they can best address health concerns, safety concerns, especially in this era where digital media and silo effects tend to steal so much from our youth communities.
Thank you, Krishna.
I think partially one of the things we discussed, and is that the transitions are hard on the kids, and it's a source of stress. I think there's a pretty good consensus that this 4K2 model is lower stress, and it will allow kids to develop better relationships with their peers and with their the staff that's in the building over a longer period of time. I do think that it makes positive, the things you brought up. I think that the evidence we have is that this will be a positive effect. Of course, these are younger kids, so there's limitation there. But I think that this is all to the good in terms of those concerns that you're raising.
Yeah, if I may briefly speak to my personal experience, when I came as an open enrollment student, can't believe that was 10 years ago, in second grade, what really helped for me to adjust to this community was the support of the administration. They had opportunities where myself and other open enrollment students could connect with staff, find trusted adults, and also bring in students that we could talk to and really rely on. And speaking from that personal experience, I recognize that the impact that had on me to adapt and to adjust to a community that I was wholly unfamiliar with has effects that I can still feel to this day. And so that really speaks to my belief that if we can allow for students to have positive environments where they can have those relationships and ponder those topics which all affect them, as even with the fact that there are obviously a lot of maturity concerns there, which will be naturally developed in time. I think that we have a lot of potential for our communities to increase in their impact and in their general openness.
Thanks, Krishna.
Marisha?
I just want to make a comment about the transitions to the schools. When I used to be a classroom teacher, the kids' behavior was often the most challenging at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year. And it was because that transition in and trying to figure out where everything is, and that anxiety gets in the way of learning often, and until they know the system of how their day is going to be. And also then at the end of the year, because there's going to be another change, a transition, I don't know what my summer is going to look like. And I do think having that cohesion of whatever happens in 3 months, you're going to come back to this place, and there'll be people and regardless, the other stuff is very important as to how we draw lines and decide who is where. But I think for the overall mental health of our kids, I do think there is excellent value to really move in this direction.
Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, can we move
Yes,
on?
move on.
Okay. Okay, so then the second consideration, the financial impact, and along with this, we looked at, inclusive staffing and some of the other logistical things. So the first thing, there'd be absolutely no change in our staff FTE. It's just a matter of moving students and staff equally between the two buildings. There is an attachment for you as well that shows the actual FTE that we have now and what it would look like, under a new configuration. The facilities themselves, the idea would be that we have both schools be equitable learning environments, including 4K wrap programs in both schools. Things like cubbies, bathrooms adjustments, looked at kitchen, cafeteria, playgrounds. So we looked at what might have to change to accommodate those things. The bathroom adjustment, for example, Taylor Prairie School was built as a K-2 school initially, and then as it became only 4K and 5K, the little ones, we had stools, right, in the bathrooms for the little ones, and since those were the only ones in the building, we actually lowered, the sinks and so on. At Winnetka, we still use stools, right, to accommodate the younger kids, and so those are the little things that, logistical that we might have to make adjustments, for. All in all, would not require any kind of major renovations of either school. And the playground's the one area that we talked about that we do have some accessibility issues right now at Cottage Grove School that are going to be corrected regardless of the configuration. And so those won't be any new dollars to do that. And so with that, we would keep that in mind with any improvements about the prospective younger grade level as well. But all in all, on those ideas of the facilities, nothing substantial as far as the financial impact. When we look at the staffing, as we were talking about, so this is our current staffing levels that we have in the two schools, 8 sections per grade, except we currently have 7 in second grade. Next year, everything will move to 8 sections, and we expect it to stay there for some time. One of the questions that's come up, that we talked about the enrollment increase. How do we handle that? Well, as we know, we still have a large number of open enrollment applications every year, and so we're able to maintain that for several years by just decreasing the number of open enrollment students that we accept in. Looking at capacity, we do have the capacity to go to a total of 10 sections, 5 in each school, per grade level. So we have growth was planned out when we did the last referendum. The idea is that those schools would reach their capacity about the same time Granite Ridge does, which would be many years down the road. Okay, so this is, what, Susan, what you're getting at. Okay, if this moves forward, then the change of staffing, right? And so then it moves to 4 sections per every grade level at each building. Obviously, that means some staff have to transfer from one building to the other.
Can I make a question or just a thought bubble here? If some of the teachers are really happy in their building and their license is K through 8, and they choose to stay in the building but teach a different grade level, that might be an option for people to not necessarily have to move buildings,
Yes.
right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So when I had the conversations with both the Taylor Prairie staff and Cottage Grove staff about the planning moving forward, and clearly this is an area of concern, right? How our decisions are going to be made about staffing assignments and so on, and so that the conversation that I had with them said to start with, and this would go into the phase 2 piece, right? And that's one of the reasons, probably if not, well, one of the most significant reasons that we're looking at recommending that this take another year before we move forward, to allow to have more conversation and teacher input into the process. So what I shared with the staff is, we recently went through some changes when Granite Ridge opened, right, with teachers transferring from buildings. That was a little bit different because entire grade levels moved, and so that was the easy part. The challenging part were the specialist positions, and where we were not able to accommodate everyone's request. And so, the one thing that we talked about is, okay, there's some lessons learned perhaps of what we did well in that transition, and what are some things that we maybe could have done better. And so having this time to have those conversations before we put together how the exact process, I think, is important. I could come up with a process myself, but that's not what we want. We want to make sure that we do have that input before that process is developed, and that's why I think taking the time to be thoughtful about that is really important. In the initial conversations, one of the biggest challenges is going to be when you look at part-time staff versus full-time staff. The sections don't always come out exactly even when it comes to our related arts classes, and we need partial FTEs, and how do we deal with that? And so those are the conversations that we need to have and be thoughtful about before any decisions are made. The reality of these decisions would be made about a year and a half from now, so there's plenty of time to have those conversations in the process. Okay, additional considerations with financial impact, transportation, of course, is a huge one. So we've had some initial conversations with Nelson's Bus and feel really confident that there would be no additional cost. In fact, perhaps an opportunity for more efficient routes, because when you're going to neighborhoods, that means a less, area that you're covering with those buses. We talked about, would we make adjustments to the school day schedule in order to accommodate transportation? And the answer is no. The school day schedule is really important. If we needed to adjust by 5 to 10 minutes to make things more efficient, sure, we could do that, but we would not be looking at any significant changes, in the schedules. We talked about costs of materials. I mean, one obvious thing is the libraries, right? Taylor Prairie is set up for a library to service kids in 4K and 5K, Cottage Grove School grades 1 and 2. And again, by having the extra year to transition through their normal selection, they can now do this in a 2-year process, to get those selections as where they need to be. So, so those are, again, there might be some. Potentially, we want to budget some additional costs, but for the most part, the county school funds that we have for books, would cover that well. So the bottom line, as far as the financial impact, that would be negligible. Probably the biggest thing that we talked about in there, again, would be the staffing. So I'll pause there. And any questions or comments?
Peter?
I just think doing this, it will introduce inefficiencies. When we have 4 sections, it's fine. When we have 8 sections total in 2nd grade, and we go to 9, needing, 9, and it's split between 2 schools, you're going to end up with some efficiency. There's some cost, but I'm pretty convinced that it's not going to be substantial. But I do expect 1 or 2 FTE sort of on average as we, from year to year, particularly on how enrollment plays out.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You nailed it. When you have 8 sections or 7, to make that decision to go to that next one, your class sizes don't change by much. The one positive thing that helps us that other districts have a bigger challenge is the open enrollment. The fact that we have so many open enrollment applications, we can use that and determine the number that we let in to help equalize those class sizes.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Okay, last piece, communication and engagement. And so what you have on the slides right now, on this slide, is just a list of the messaging that it has occurred since the board's been considering this. Messages to our staff, to our parents, and moving ahead, having information on the webpage, FAQ. Katie's got it ready to go, so depending on what happens tonight, making that webpage live immediately. And then, as we talk about, the second page is a huge piece where there's that not only opportunity, but it's already been stated tonight, right? The importance of that engagement and moving through that process. And again, we've already made some adjustments to our timeline, and so that flexibility, I think, is a really important point, to keep in mind, as we go along. Okay, so let me pause there, and there's obviously a ton to that, but Katie will be glad to answer any questions that you have about communications and engagement.
I guess I have a question. What does that second phase really look like, especially from the community engagement? We heard feedback from the community that their input is needed. Mm-hmm. So how are we incorporating community feedback in this?
Well, I think that's one reason that we have the later recommendation, right, is because we don't have that set right now. And I think, again, we want to hear feedback on how the feedback will be delivered and how we'll do that. Is it a committee? We don't know. Is it surveys? We don't know. Is it individual one-on-one conversations? All of those are up. Those are possible tools that we could use, but we haven't made any decisions on how that would happen at this point. So, really that alone could take 3 to 4 months as it is, right? If we really wanted to do this as in-depth as I think a lot of people are sharing, they would like to hear that done. So there isn't a decision today to say this is how we're going to move forward. Sure. So your input, family input, staff input, those would all play into how even the process would move forward.
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I'll just jump in, just as an example, right? The big, one of the big things, the boundaries, right? How are those going to be determined?
Yeah.
And so I think it's a good example that there's a lot of different ways we could go to make that, could we have a small committee to put that together and make sure, sure, but that's something clearly that we need to engage, our community with. And so that would be the type of thing that after we have that, this board will make that decision on the process. I'll bring forth certainly recommendations with it, but I think there's a lot of ways that we can do that, and the board will have that conversation, and I think it's essential then that we do that before we move forward.
Yeah, I agree, and that's what I was gonna say, Dan, and I think to your point, Susan, around kind of timing of this and community feedback, sort of my expectation from, like, as TLE chair, and I've shared this with Dan, is that some of these big decision points, like, how are we gonna determine boundaries, like, that to me is board discussion first, which means administration can't move on that until we have that discussion, we have a recommendation, and so it's like, for me, I want us to be able to collectively as a board talk about and feel comfortable with those key decision points on how we're engaging families in particular, but also teachers around this process. And so, yeah, Dan and I have already talked about some ideas around what the recommendations might be around boundaries, for example, but I think there are a couple other elements there too.
Susan? Well, I think, again, the piece that I just feel a little bit differently about it, and again, I'm telling you, it's not about support for this program or plan. It's about, we just have a little different feeling about the timing and the information that helps make a good decision. And so when you look at key consideration, communication, engagement, you're talking about going to the staff, and it looks like you went out. There was a message on June 1st, a meeting on August 28th, then a meeting with all elementary Cottage Grove staff and TPS staff, 9/12. Well, by the way, that was yesterday, so what kind of feedback do we have? And then plan for additional follow-up after tonight's meeting. Well, that's great. But if I made a decision by that time, I don't know. I'm not going to have that information to help me support that decision and my feedback on the process as well. Message to families, September 6th. Follow up to families after September 13th board meeting. All of a sudden, the feedback from staff really and families is condensed into like a week, and it isn't really prior to the meeting, it's after the meeting. And I just feel it's important. The word we talk about all the time is transparency in what we do. Then the process that you've been very thoughtful about can make sure you've already addressed the concerns.
So I think there are a couple of things, and I want to comment on your idea around transparency, Susan, because I appreciate that, and I would say from my perspective, like, this process has been like articulated, we've discussed it on multiple occasions, both in TLE and as a full board. And so part of the considerations for being able to make the determination on whether or not we even want to move to community school, so forget about implementation, that's like phase 2, right? Phase 1 is like, is this the right thing to do by kids? We had that conversation back in June around what were the factors that we wanted folks to consider, right, the administration to consider, to present to us here. And so, like, it's not that the timeline was short, and like, that was the timeline. We talked in June about it. Teachers got notified in June. I think the date in there is actually incorrect, but I think it was later than June 1st that they got notified, because our meeting was, but anyway, it doesn't matter. So they got notified. I will say parental notification, and I'm happy to own that piece of it. And so you have a couple of key times to engage with families, right? It's the end of the school year, where families are already getting bombarded with end of the school year stuff, right? You have beginning of the school, like very beginning of the school year, where families are getting bombarded with beginning of the school year stuff, right? And then, so it was determined that that Tuesday after we came back from Memorial Day was the best day, where it's a clean communication, right? It comes through as it comes through, as opposed to getting stuck in the noise. And I can tell you, Susan, from a parent perspective, like, the amount of times my phone beeps to tell me to check my email because I have a district email, or an email from CGS, or an email from Cottage Grove School, like, it's innumerable in those weeks waning down from school and leading up to school. And so it wouldn't have made, our communication would have been less transparent. It would have gotten lost had we sent it out in August. It just would have. It would have got lost. It would have got lost if we would have sent it at the end of the year.
We obviously disagree about timeframes, but that's fine. We've already talked about that, and that's been forwarded. But the pieces I'm going to tell you again that I don't have are, you sent a message to families September 6th. So what do we know and what did we hear? And you basically had a meeting with staff on the 12th, which was yesterday. What did you learn, and what do we know, and what's the feedback? And that's a piece of what I expected to get tonight to help me feel comfortable in this decision-making tonight. I still don't have that. And I don't know how to make that any clearer, you know? So, Rochelle, do you have that?
That's what I was.
Rochelle, I just want to clarify.
She's on the committee.
No, I just want to ask a question of clarification for you. So what would you prefer? I mean, if you don't feel comfortable
I would like
tonight,
to make the board decision in October with the understanding that we're going to get feedback in some kind of format, either in a presentation or a program or listening sessions. I mean, the work that administration did, and Katie helped manage,
And my committee.
for the referendum.
No, I'm
Did you
talking
work
about
on
for
that?
this. My committee has worked very diligently on this, Susan.
That's right.
And it's frustrating to me a little bit that, like, we talked about in June what the factors were going to be, right, in order to talk about this in September, and we're here in September, and we want to move the goalpost, and I find that a little bit, it's a little disconcerting to me.
I specifically talked to Dan, and I actually mentioned that because I'm not allowed to talk at the teaching learning, but you allowed me.
Susan,
You.
thank you.
No, by policy, I'm not allowed to.
But you do, and I acknowledge you.
I asked first.
But I'm just saying, like, engage in good faith a little bit
We
around
can
that
argue about
piece.
that all day long. The point being, for me, was I asked very specifically for a plan to be able to see that for communication with the staff and their feedback and gathering that feedback, and for the community and gathering that feedback.
I hear you, Susan.
And that's the only piece I don't have. And you know, you're working on it, so why don't we just get it and then move?
Lorraine?
there's a couple, Rochelle, Philip, and then, okay.
Just a couple questions. So, what was the response, and Susan just asked this, kind of when you did send the email out? Because I think I saw one email that came to my email. Did you guys get much response from the parent or the family email that went out? That's the first point or question. The second question is, I do feel like after what we went through this last week, I do appreciate having a little more time for listening and giving teachers and families a chance to share their concerns. So I would be okay with a month off, but at the same time, I do feel like this is the right decision. So, but yeah, did you get much response?
I had one parent respond, and
hit the
actually,
one.
And then,
Julie's here tonight,
Yeah.
we had a,
Okay.
nice conversation about that. To answer your question about the staff, so as you know, the committee met on Monday night, so I met with the Cottage Grove and Taylor Prairie staff yesterday to inform them of what happened at the committee meeting, and that the recommendation was that we were going to recommend that this be implemented a year later. This feedback was very clearly, overwhelmingly, thank you. I mean, they very much were supportive of having that extra year.
Thank you. Philip?
Yeah, so I share some of Susan's concerns. And again, no judgment on all of the process that your committee's gone through, or really, I think it's all being done exactly right. But I think particularly the message to families only being a week ago, I'm not sure I feel comfortable, with that small of a window. I imagine some people may not have even seen the email yet. And I guess what I'm wondering is, with the date being moved to the 25-26 school year, what is another month, right? What are we losing, right? Why rush this decision, I guess, or why make a decision if it feels even slightly rushed? I guess if we really are truly losing something critical in the timeline, I'd like to hear about it, but I'm struggling to understand why tonight has to be the time to make this decision versus 4 weeks from now. Just to give people a little bit more time to.
I'm going to make a motion. I move approval to implement the 4K2 grade configuration for both Cottage Grove School and Taylor Prairie School at the beginning of the 2025-2026 school year.
Second?
Any further discussion?
Yeah, I just want to point out that if people want to postpone it until the next meeting, you can make a motion to do so now. That's fine. If I could continue to comment, I believe, and we've seen a lot of feedback and got a lot of information about this. The committee's been through quite a bit of process, and I'm prepared to make a decision. When I look at this, I am pretty convinced that there's a pretty good consensus, which I'm not going to judge, but I'm just going to say there's a consensus among the educational professionals that this is the right thing educationally to do for the students. And then the flip side of that, are there any costs that are excessive? And I believe the costs are in line with that overall this is a benefit for the district. The concern about what I have that's not on the slides and what we've heard from the community is something I think we need to get moving on, which is this issue of the boundaries, communicating the boundaries and getting that's going to be an issue, and it's going to be some work. And not only that, but this board is something that the board is going to have to deal with at some level for the rest of its existence, because boundaries are always an issue. But that's all right. I mean, it's if this is educationally the right thing to do for students, not 2 students, but 4 students. Then I think that the adults are going to have to just deal with this issue with the boundaries. And I think that there are plenty of there are satisfactory ways to solve the problem that will get general agreement and approval from the community, but never from everybody. But it's just something that we have to move ahead with, and get the process started. And I'm 100% convinced that we can do it satisfactorily. It is something, though, we need to get moving on. I want to see an understanding of the boundaries in the community and feedback. And actually, this is one thing where we really do need to get feedback on the community is, okay, we're going to do this. What should the boundaries be? Where do we draw the lines? Because both communication as, get people used to the process, understanding the process, and dealing with it so nobody can say, oh, this is a surprise. And but it's an outreach, both an outreach piece, plus we need to gather their input and look for any concerns. And it was, in fact, that process, I think, that kept us from doing this in 2018, was like, we're building a new school, we have a referendum. We talked about it at the time, it's like, well, this boundary issue is just something we don't have the bandwidth to deal with at this time. But I think now that that's behind us and we're moving along, it's a good time to deal with it. And I understand the concerns about communication. I think I have enough information, and I think I've heard enough about how the staff particularly feels about it. And also, the discussions with the community we did send out, we did not get a big groundswell of, we can't possibly do this, yeah, sure, people get concerned about boundaries, but it's been a pretty, small response. And I understand the concern, but I don't think that's anybody's throwing that up as a showstopper to us. So I'm ready to make a decision on this.
Krishna?
I just have a brief question, inconsequential to the current debate, which is, given the fact that Monona Grove's openness and opportunity is essential to its identity and growth, I was curious to see how best, via this policies and the concerns of this board, we can best streamline student input to teachers and administration regarding the effects these policies will have upon them.
So It's actually a really great point, Krishna, and I think interesting one to think about why now and what will forward do, which I think is a very fair question. To me, I think the evidence that we have through research, the due diligence that Talia has done in coordination with the administration has made it, like, to me, abundantly clear that, like, this is the right thing to do by kids. The what is, it is this. I think what we're all talking about is input on the how. And the administration can't move forward on input on the how until we agree on the what. And to Peter's point, the idea around, I think, boundaries are going to be the biggest thing that we're going to have to tussle with as a community. If you go watch the 2018 meeting, that's all it was about. It was all about folks in the community concerned around boundaries. And the sooner we start engaging folks on that conversation, the more likely it will be that we will be ready to go in 25, 26, and whatever configuration that, like, whatever that looks like, with teachers who are clear in understanding of what it is and on board, families that are clear about what's happening and on board. But the more that we delay the what, the longer it takes us to get to the how. And that, to me, does a disservice to our community, right? Because that shortens their window to be able to implement or talk about the implementation of the how. And so to me, that's the 4-week piece of it, right? Is it like urgent, if we don't do it now, something terrible is going to happen? No, but every time you shorten the window, that's 4 weeks of feedback that you don't get now. And what I keep hearing everyone say, and I agree, is that we want community input and community feedback. So let's do it. Let's get moving on it so that we can go and engage in that way.
Susan?
I would like to make an amendment to the motion that the decision be moved to the October board meeting. And the reason that I'd like to do that is so that we can get that input prior to the board making that decision and make sure we have addressed all the issues. Here's the interesting thing, just so you know, Elizabeth and I totally agree on this. We just disagree about having the board approval and then working on the input. I just want to get the input first so I can make sure all the issues are addressed. So wait, then if there's no second, then it fails for lack of a second, and it's clear the rest of the board wants to do it tonight.
Wants to vote tonight.
Just a point, that's not a motion to amend, it's a motion to postpone to our next meeting. You said you wanted to make a motion to amend this, you wanted to amend this motion. What you want to do is postpone it. It's different. You said amend, you meant to postpone.
The motion was to approve it, and my motion was to approve it on October, in the October meeting.
Your motion would be to postpone until October meeting.
You can make whatever motion you want, Peter.
Krishna?
Prior to considering those motions, my only question remaining, therefore, would be, besides the extra time granted by a postponement, are there any other incentives or actions that could be taken by this board to drive a increase in response and transparency, again, beyond just the extension of time?
Not if we make that decision tonight. No, the answer is no.
Okay, here's my question, see if I can ask it right. If we voted yes for this, and the community expresses in great numbers that they don't like the idea or they don't like the boundaries, what happens then?
So to me, I would separate those things, right? One, the consensus across sort of all the professional educators, right, across the research, like Peter talked about, is that this configuration, this model is what's best for kids. It's what's best for kids in learning, right? For all the reasons that we've been talking about since June, since you all have been talking about since 2018. So to me, like, that's an educational decision, and part of our charge as the board is to, like, steward our mission, right, towards the educational experience of our youth here. Second to that is the boundaries, which is about implementation, and I feel like those two things are getting conflated. Like, saying yes, we want to move to this community school model, it has nothing to do with the boundaries, except for it triggers Dan and his staff to be able to think about what might that look like? Katie to start pulling folks together, make a recommendation to us about whether we want an ad hoc committee to talk about boundaries. Do we want to do a road show to talk about boundaries, right? So then we can start getting into like the actual logistics and the things that I think really matter and are important to families. But I want us to separate, and it was important, we talked about this in June, which is why I'm a little bit frustrated around this kind of word transparency that keeps throwing around, because we had this conversation in June around, this is an educational decision, right? We're gonna inform families that this discussion was happening. We were gonna engage with the staff so that they were aware that it was happening, which we did, so we met all of those marks. And now it's time for us to make a determination about this as an educational decision. And then from there, right, it's community and family input on like how we do it so we can do it well by kids and families. But doing this in and of itself, to me, is the right thing to do, because it's gonna make the educational experience of our youth better. And I guess, like, why wouldn't we do that?
Can I just make a point of order here, though? I made a motion that was seconded, and then Susan had wanted to amend that, so we should really, there's a motion on the table, we were discussing that, and then Susan made another motion, so we should go back to figure out if there's a second to Susan's motion.
There's no second.
I'll second Susan's motion.
Okay, we have a
So there is a second to Susan's
Okay.
motion.
And I would just ask that we restate it as a motion to postpone until the October.
So then can we, I would like to understand what that motion was, to get some clarification.
Okay, the reason I'd rather make it the way I've made it, effectively, it is a motion to postpone, but I wanted to a specific date, and that's why I am using a specific date rather than just the general language of postpone.
And what is the date?
Now, it's the October meeting,
Okay,
unless they would like to take 2 weeks and schedule one in 2 weeks.
okay.
What I'm trying to do is, my intent is to allow time to bring feedback from the community so that we know the issues are being addressed
Okay.
and the staff.
And then that's been
Rather
seconded.
than approving it and then taking care of them as you go through and getting the feedback and wondering if they're being taken care of. This way we'll know there's a plan.
Okay, so that's been seconded, so I'm going to call the vote now on that motion.
Except that we need to have a vote
We have
to call the vote.
That's, no we don't,
Yeah, we do.
no we don't, because it's been seconded.
No, but if you want to call the vote without discussion, any more discussion, then we have to have a vote on calling the vote.
Well, I think we had a lot of discussion.
Right, so right now, we're discussing the amendment to postpone.
Okay.
And the question is there any other comment on the amendment to postpone?
Dan, you were going to say something?
Well, I would agree that the motion was not an amendment, it's a separate motion. And I don't know the answer to this, but I'm not sure that you can act on that before you act on Eric's motion.
So why are you seeing that as not an amendment?
The motion was to approve a plan, an amendment would be to, you can add to it. Or
So my amendment is to add specificity, which is to approve the plan on October, what's the date of the October meeting? So it's an amendment with additional language. That's exactly.
Can I make a suggestion, Susan? Since there was a motion on the table, can we just maybe vote on it and see what, I mean, and then maybe if the votes don't go through, we can come back to.
We can vote on the amendment, and if it's not.
But I'm confused about the amendment too, actually. I
The
don't quite
amendment
understand.
is to move the board decision. What's the date of it?
October 11th?
October 11th.
That's
To October 11th.
Hang on a second, Susan. If you make an amendment to the motion and we don't pass the main motion tonight, then your amendment doesn't have any effect.
Yeah.
Right.
I agree.
Which is why you have to make a motion to postpone to a specific date.
Postpone the vote.
You need to make, the motion you want to make is to postpone till the October meeting this motion that's already been made.
I've already said, if you would like to add the language to postpone until the October 11th meeting, I'm fine with that.
Add the language to what? All right,
So let's do the.
could you please state the motion that we're debating, the motion that we're debating right now? Because that's the job of the president, and I don't want to misspeak for anybody else.
So are we talking about the amendment piece of it or the original?
Is it an amendment or a postponement?
Oh. I think postponement would be fine, right? We're suggesting postponing it to the next board meeting.
That's not how it works. But it's,
It is.
again, truthfully, straight up, this is a straightforward request. It is an amendment to a motion. You can bicker about whatever language you want, and truthfully, after closed session, I'm feeling mildly bullied. So we can work on this issue together as a board. Just put it up and vote it up or vote it down. If you don't support it,
Well, we'll just
We just want the
just state your
language.
amendment, please. Just state your amendment.
my amendment is to postpone. It has to be off of Eric's motion. So you need that motion first.
My
And the
motion was,
Is to approve the configuration,
correct.
okay?
My motion was to approve to approve the implement a 4K2 grade configuration for both Cottage Grove School and Taylor Prairie School at the beginning of the 2025-2026 school year. That was my motion.
And my addition to that is, and to postpone that decision until the October 11th meeting.
I
You're
I
making,
understand what you're saying, Susan, but that doesn't make sense to me. Procedurally. I don't
Right, I feel like you
understand
want to postpone.
procedurally how that would.
Because if we just,
Okay.
Yeah.
So, according to Roberts, okay, as Peter mentioned, a motion to postpone, you can make a motion to postpone Eric's motion. If that passes, then it's postponed until the time that you decide.
Okay, so that's Robert's rules, so that's what we need to go by.
I guess I'm just confused why you're frustrated by that, because it sounds like that's what you want. You want to postpone the vote for next month. So I'm not understanding.
that isn't exactly what happens. His motion is to approve it.
Mm-hmm.
So effectively, if you do it that way, it's you're postponing the approval until October 11th.
Correct.
Yeah.
I want to postpone the motion.
Right.
It's exactly what you're doing.
Yeah.
You're approving, you're postponing, acting on his motion until October.
Right. Which is what you want, right?
all right, is there any more discussion?
That is what I want. I'm not convinced that that's the
Okay,
appropriate parliamentary procedure, but if that's the understanding that we'll be voting on as a board, then I'll accept that. Just because, at this point, guys, I'm ready. This is not a pleasant place to be tonight. So.
okay, so should we restate the motion so that it's clear?
Yes.
Do you want to do it, Peter? Or
I think that the motion we have is a motion to postpone until our October board meeting, the main motion.
And I'd request the individual vote.
Is there a second?
I second it.
Okay.
any further
Then we-
discussion?
Yeah, so one thing I want to say is that for folks that want to postpone this until October, it would be very helpful if you were incredibly clear about what it is you need between now and that meeting. Because when we had this conversation in June, that was the question on the table, right? What is all the things that we need, right? We talked about it. What do you need? Anything else? Anything else? Anything else? And so, to me, we've exhausted and drilled it down, and we've talked about it. So, like, what additional information would you need between now and October? Because I don't want to get to the meeting on October if this passes, and then say, oh, we need more information, and we need more information, because then we're just killing time.
I think my understanding is I've made it very clear tonight. and
I
made it
disagree,
very clear,
Susan,
and
that you've made it clear.
then we haven't listened to each other appropriately, and I'll work on that.
Philip, you were gonna say something, or just?
Yeah, no, I just need time. That's all I'm looking for. So I don't think actually the committee needs to offer really much more. I think the presentation tonight was great, and I think the information was thorough. I just want more time for myself to think about it, study it, and then just time to allow for people who maybe haven't seen certain communications to see those communications and reach out if they want to. That's really it. You know, it's not so much that I'm against this or fighting it or something like that. I simply want time.
Yeah.
So I think actually, the feedback that from June, I think you guys did a great job. It's just that I'm consuming it right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I would like to have a gap between consuming it and voting on it. So that's all it is. It's just time.
That's
I
fair.
think I feel kind of similar in that way, that I support this idea, but I just want to give more time for the community to share their feedback. We heard today, some from community members, that they wanted to share some feedback, and maybe there are others that are out there as well. But I think giving that extra time allows for that.
I was just going to say, I'm not going to vote for the postponement, but I would encourage anybody who believes that they need more information to make a good decision
Yeah.
to, vote for the postponement.
Absolutely.
Okay, can move to vote. I guess all those in favor?
Let's
do
refer what we're voting for, so everybody understands. So
Okay.
we're voting for the to postpone.
Correct.
The motion that I made until the next board meeting in October, correct?
Yes.
Susan, was that correct?
Could we do a roll call vote?
Yes, absolutely. I
Thanks.
think that's really helpful. Okay, roll call vote. Rochelle?
For motion to postpone,
Yes.
I'm okay with that, so I'll say yes.
Okay. Susan, Manning?
Aye.
Nay.
Aye.
Aye.
Nay.
Nay. So it passes.
So passes.
Passes.
So we'll bring this up.
All right, motion is carried. Okay, moving on.
No, because we just postponed it.
To the 2023-2024 non-represented support staff compensation plan. Yes.
Deanne, do we have to vote? We voted on the amendment, but don't we also have to vote on the
We
motion?
voted
No,
on
it
postponement. It
supersedes
wasn't
the-
an amendment, Susan. It was a postponement. We voted on it, and it's going to be
Okay.
postponed till October.
Dan, you want me to do this, or you want to?
I'll kick it off then if you
Okay.
want to, yeah. So what we're, have is the support staff compensation plan for consideration this evening. It was presented to the Personnel Committee in August. And I think Nicole's memo, did a very good job of summarizing the work that was done to put this together and how it's different from our previous plan. And so, the Personnel Committee went through it in depth as well, so I'm going to turn over.
We did go through it in depth, and there was unanimous support from the Personnel Committee, and one of the main things was the difference of making non-exempt pay ranges, which offers some more flexibility and transparency for positions like lifeguard, school nutrition assistant, district grounds, administrative assistant, accounting specialist, business services specialist, certified occupational therapist, payroll specialist, and data and assessment specialist. So Personnel Committee supports this decision.
Sorry, we're the non-represented. Yeah, I was going to make a motion for approval of the 2023-2024 non-represented staff compensation plan as presented.
Second.
Any further discussion? I think I'm going to do roll call votes for the little night. Rochelle?
Aye.
Aye.
Susan Manning?
She said it really quickly.
Oh, I'm not ready. Elizabeth,
Sorry.
sorry. Philip?
Aye.
Eric?
Aye.
Peter?
Aye.
Maureen? Aye. Ayes have it. Motion is carried.
Sorry.
Okay, next is the 2023-2024 individual administrator compensation.
I would move approval of the 2023-2024 individual administrative compensation as presented.
I'll second.
Any further discussion?
I just want to note that, we, increase the teacher and staff salaries by 8% this year, based on the cost of living estimate from the state. What we're doing with the administrators is, falls along those lines, the 8%.
All right. Roll call vote. Rochelle?
Aye.
Susan?
Aye.
Elizabeth?
Aye.
Philip?
Aye.
Eric?
Nay.
And Peter?
Aye.
Lorraine? Aye. Ayes have it. Motion is carried. Okay, moving on to the 2023-2024 Dane County School Consortium Director Contract.
Okay, so again, this is for the executive director. We are part of a consortium with 16 other school districts in Dane County, but we're the fiscal agent, so everything runs through our books, including payroll. So this recommendation has been approved by our executive board, but it needs to come to this board for approval as well. So there's no additional cost to us. The consortium pays the salaries of everyone that's involved with that program, but we're looking for board approval of that contract.
Motion.
Oh, sorry. I will move approval of 2023-2025 Dane County School Consortium Director Contract as presented.
I'll second.
All right, any further discussion? Okay, move to roll call vote.
I have a question.
Yes.
So the person named here is a partner of someone, of an administrator in our district, right?
Yes.
So it's not a conflict of interest, no? To like have a contract with them?
There's no relation at all to
Okay.
our schools,
Okay, great, thank you.
our elementary schools.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, roll call vote. Rochelle?
Aye.
Susan?
Aye.
Elizabeth?
Aye.
Philip?
Aye.
Eric?
Aye.
Peter?
Aye.
Lorraine, aye. Ayes have it. Motion is carried. Okay, moving on to date, time, location for 2024 annual meeting and budget hearing.
I would like to move approval of the date, time, location for the 2024 annual meeting and budget hearing as Monday, September 9th, 2024 at 6 p.m. in the district office.
Second?
All right, any further discussion? Yes.
I'd just like to say, I think we had just a few little bumps in the road at the annual meeting this year with the booklet and the, getting the notice out about the annual meeting. And, I think the community doesn't understand that basically we approve this date a year ahead. So I just think we need to work a little harder to make sure we've got that information ready. I was looking for it at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and wasn't able to find it. Just to review it, because I didn't want to go in, not understanding it. And then, plus then I could call Mark or send him an email if I had a question. So I fully approve of doing this and doing it soon and hoping that we can just kind of get the bumps out of the road out next year so we can get the information out.
Duly noted. Thank you. Okay, any other questions? Roll call vote. Rochelle?
Aye.
Susan?
Aye.
Elizabeth?
Aye.
Philip?
Aye.
Eric?
Aye.
Peter?
Aye.
Lorraine? Aye. Ayes have it. Motion is carried. All right, moving to the 2023-2024 Teacher Handbook revisions approved August 9th, 2023.
Well, go ahead, Peter.
I would just comment, there's 4 sections that for consideration here. Section 19, we already reversed on September 6th. We don't have to deal with that. Section 805, COVID leave, that expired June 30th, 2023 per policy. And so the modification here to the teacher's handbook just reflects some change that was already made. And for us to change the handbook means that we're reinstating this policy that's expired and there needs to be some consideration, because actually we're changing the handbook, but we're not changing the policy. So there would need to be some additional consideration for that particular item.
Can you say that again, Peter?
The COVID leave policy already expired.
Oh, right.
The change to the teacher's handbook was simply to update the handbook to reflect that change in policy. If we were to do anything about the language in the
Gotcha, now, I didn't hear
handbook,
the first part.
it doesn't match what actually is our COVID, our actual policy. So we got to be careful about that. The other two sections, 21, 25, are different.
I think Krishna had a question and then Susan.
Yeah, just a comment. In lieu of my inability to attend last week's meeting, I seek to state that, quite frankly, the teachers of Monona Grove are the primary factor of not only influencing who I am today as a person, but also in making this administration what truly shines in our community. I mean, if you look onto the crowd today, you can see several individuals who eventually would make it possible for me to have a journey like this that would allow for me to be a student representative to this board. And so in regards to that, I would say that, well, I wholeheartedly believe that students constitute the very fabric of what our district stands for. Their dreams are near impossible without the work of teachers, and so therefore I would like to display my appreciation to this board in not only hearing the concerns of teachers, but also swiftly acting upon them. So as a student who is directly impacted by what happens to the teachers of our district, I would like to say I'm very grateful for what this board is doing to support them.
Thank you, Krishna. Susan?
I would propose a motion to reinstate the original teacher handbook language that existed prior to the August 9th, 2023 board meeting, except for section 1902 and section 25, and that the proposed revisions be referred to Personnel Committee and MGEA for meet and confer. I want to make a couple comments about the language. Basically, the rationale being to follow board process and board policy by having the Personnel Committee review revisions to the teacher handbook prior to board action, and to provide for review by MGA prior to board action. I accepted sections 19.02 as the board has already rescinded approval of that section, and sent it back to Personnel and MGEA for review. I also accepted section 25 as also all those sections include increases in teacher payment that have already begun to be paid out and would require return of the funds.
Susan, can I ask, are you considering section 8, the COVID leave as well, or are you just really talking about section?
All revisions, back to you.
Including section 8 COVID leave?
Right.
Okay.
For
So
review.
So we're looking at section 805 and section 21, essentially. what you're
Any
saying.
other revisions other than those two?
Okay. Okay. I would say that really we're looking at 21, but if you want to send the COVID leave back, but as Peter said, it kind of expires anyway, so.
It's expired.
Well, it's not in policy that I can find.
Policy hasn't met.
Okay.
It may be something we deal with,
Yeah.
That's
because
fine.
right now the statistics are very clear. There is still COVID in the community. There is a significant, someone said to me, quote unquote, it's just like having the flu, and that is not true. The death rate is 19% higher for COVID. The hospitalizations are close to 40% higher than flu. And if you haven't known somebody who's gotten COVID in the last month, I'm surprised, because it is still a seriously contagious disease. All I want us to do is review it. I just want you to review it. That's it. And if you want it deleted, that's fine. We haven't met as policy, and we'd be happy to look at that as well.
Okay, we have a motion now.
Can I second her
Yeah,
motion?
give me a second.
Yes.
Any further discussion? Yes.
Yeah, Dan, where is the COVID leave policy established?
It was not put into the policy manual. It was a standalone policy that was communicated through the handbooks.
Okay, but it is communicated through the handbooks.
Right.
Okay, but it did expire
It
in
did.
June, so
So it does not exist.
it doesn't exist. So if we put the language back in the handbooks, it still doesn't exist, right?
Right.
So I'd like to amend the motion to also, we can consider COVID leave policy, certainly.
Right.
But we have to make sure, we have to make sure that the language all adds up. This is one of you gotta be careful you don't have something in policy that you do in the handbook and vice versa. So I'd like to ask to amend the motion to add, to exclude section 8.05 COVID leave.
Second.
And I support having discussion about COVID policy going forward, but I do understand that this was implemented as a temporary measure from the beginning.
Any further discussion?
Yes. The reason I would like it to go back to policy, to personnel, is that I would like them to send that recommendation back to us. Basically, when you look at policy, the language seems to say to us that the revisions for the handbook are to come from them and be reviewed by them. And I just would like their input on it, and if they say to us that needs to come out, then that's fine. Then we just approve that. But I want the review. I want to follow the procedure of reviewing policy revisions in personnel.
The motion is to send this back to the Personnel Committee, not to rescind it, to send it back?
So we've already approved it. It's basically, effectively, the motion would reinstate the original language prior to the night. So this language that we approved deleting would go back in for your review and teacher notification.
Okay, but first, before we get to that, we have an amendment that's been seconded, so.
That's right. You have to vote on the amendment first.
And this is simply a bureaucratic lining up the language issue. And it is because the COVID leave policy was temporary and it expired, it didn't need committee approval to expire.
Right.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I agree with Peter. I think to put the COVID leave back into the handbook when it's not a policy that exists anymore, you can't act on it. So putting it back in the handbook does not reinstate COVID leave because it's already expired. So to me, the conversation to have at personnel is is there still a need for COVID leave or additional sick bank or whatever that's gonna look like? So I think that's a useful conversation to have. But I agree with Peter that for clarity, having it in the handbook is not helpful because there's nothing there.
And that enables them to make that recommendation if it comes back to them.
They can talk about that regardless of whether it comes back to them. Eric can put that on the agenda.
But then we go back to the fact that the process was deleted by administration.
But it was
rather
deleted
than-
because it doesn't exist anymore.
We just disagree about the process, that's fine.
Philip?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think the one phrase in the COVID leave policy that I'm guessing, matters is at which time it will be reevaluated, right? If that wasn't in there, then I agree, the entire thing is completely inert. So I'm just wondering if perhaps to make sure that the board acknowledges that, that statement that we will actually reevaluate it versus just strike it. Perhaps we can combine leaving it stricken with an actual, I don't know how it works, a board motion or something that we will talk about this at the personnel committee, right? Like something that's more guaranteed than just us saying we're going to do it.
Well, I don't know. I trust Eric if he says
I
he'll
do too,
it.
but
He'll do it.
But-
I'll do it,
Same.
and I agree that we need to discuss COVID leave because I don't think it's
Right.
realistic to have a teacher that tests positive for COVID and they can't come to school.
For 5 days.
And then they have to use all their, this just doesn't make sense unless we have some policy where they can come to school, so.
Right.
So I agree, but I also agree with Peter that this is procedurally, language-wise, it's a little confusing, the way that it's written. So I guess we have an amendment we need to vote on, so. I'm going to bring this up to personnel. I'll meet with Dan and we'll discuss, and then we'll schedule a personnel meeting. We will discuss this. So I will do that, but I don't think that we need to do it in this context. So.
Can we restate the motion just so that the
It's amendment to remove section 8.05 from the main motion.
Okay. So we already had discussion, so we can do roll call vote. Rochelle?
Aye.
Nay.
Aye.
Aye.
Eric?
Aye.
Aye. Ayes have it, motion is carried.
Now I will discuss this with Dan.
So that removes it.
Because
Right.
it's probably not appropriate to call it COVID leave, but
Yeah, we'll.
a bigger picture
I will.
going forward, yes.
So going back to now, the motion is for section 19, which Susan has said we've already addressed, section 21, and section 25, which Susan has also alluded to, that we likely will not need to make any changes.
Mhm.
So right now, we're actually section 21.
We're talking about section 21.
All right.
And section 21, for just to review, is professional hours and workday. And in section 21, there were some areas that were removed regarding faculty meetings, administratively called meetings, flexible scheduling during the work week. So I would like to take those back to personnel and discuss them.
Peter?
Yeah, and as far as I'm concerned, there's some subtleties, and they certainly need some discussion and review, and happy to make a recommendation from the committee.
Okay. All right, so we're done with those motions for that. Okay.
Well,
Well, we got them in the main motion. We have to vote on
Yeah,
the
still
main
vote on the
motion.
main motion.
Okay, so who wants to make the motion?
It's been made.
It's been made and
We just need to
seconded.
vote on it.
All right, sounds good. A lot of back and
I know.
forth.
A lot of Roberts
All right.
today.
Rochelle?
Aye.
Susan?
Aye.
Elizabeth?
Aye.
Philip?
Aye.
Eric?
Aye.
Peter? Lorraine? Aye. Ayes have it, motion is carried. All right, there are no discussion items. And then future meeting dates. So they are listed in board docs, and then upcoming meetings are TLE on September 26th, and then our next board meeting is on October 11th. Can I have a motion for adjournment?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Ayes have it, meeting's adjourned.
Well, my computer did not make it
You do
through.
want to look at since we win something.
Yes, yes, I do.
But it's not necessarily.
Yes, I do.
Okay.